In this movie, we're going to look at some more complex conditionals. So far, we've only seen what happens with a simple if statement. And we put our condition in, we put a statement in to be executed if the condition is true, and then any other commands we put here are going to be carried out regardless of anything to do with our conditional. What if we wanted to allow PHP to go down two different paths? One if this condition is true, and one if the condition is false. We use the else statement. This allows PHP rather to follow this path if this condition is true, but we have an alternative here which allows us to have a statement that will only be carried out if the statement is not. So let's try that, see it in practice, and let's set this number here to 2, and let's refresh the screen. Not more than 5. So in our example, this was the statement that was carried out, and this statement was not. So we can see here that PHP made a choice based on this condition and went down this path and not this one. Now, we can make it more complicated still. For instance, the elseif command. This can be written two ways. We can either write it as two separate words, which is perfectly acceptable, or we can run it together as an elseif command. Whichever way you choose is completely up to you. Now when we use our elseif command, the if statement here works just like the first if statement. We use the rounded brackets after it, and then we put in another condition. So in this case, it's going to be if num equals 5, then we'll use a statement that makes sense here. For instance, equals 5. And then we put another, we close that statement there with another curly bracket there. Once again, we could put any number of statements here, such as yes, it does, for instance. Of course, we could use different kinds of statements. Just using the echo command because that's the only one we've learned so far. We'll get into more complex commands later on. Now, after that, we could just use a plain else. And logically, if num is not greater than 5 and is not equal to 5, then it's probably less than 5. So, let's try this one out and see what we get. Less than 5. And of course, if we start with different values for num, we'll get different outcomes. Equals 5. So we can see in this example how our if statements can be quite clever and allow for quite a different number of outcomes based on, in this case, the value of a variable. We can get more complicated than this. Let's go back to here, cut that out, and what we can do to allow for a more complex system of conditions is what's called nesting if statements. Now this is where the indents come in really handy so that we can see exactly what we're doing. As we saw in the example I've just wiped out, each of the statements here was indented. Now this is not strictly necessary for PHP to carry out the code properly, but it helps us as human beings because we can then see a clear distinction between the conditions here and the statements which PHP will choose depending on whether they're true or false. But here's where the indentation really comes into its own. If we were going to nest two if statements, and what nesting means is we put one if statement inside the curly brackets for another. So in this case, if num is greater than 5, then we evaluate this if statement, which says if num is greater than 10, we're going to open another set of curly brackets, and then we're going to indent twice, and that's going to say more than 10. And then we can put an else command in there, and we can say more than 5 but less than 10. Now, first of all, let's save that. Now let's see how PHP works through this script and gets to where it should be. Say if we took the number 7, then it gets the first if statement here, evaluates it to true because it's greater than 5. It gets the second if statement, looks at that, is 7 greater than 10? It says no, so it's not going to carry out this statement. It goes down to the else statement here, and it's going to carry out this one because it's greater than 5 and it's not greater than 10. So let's test that out, make sure it works. There we go. That's our first nested conditional script. Once again, I recommend you try these out yourself and get to grips with exactly how they work, and try making your scripts, try making your conditions as complicated as you like. If it stops working the way you expect it to, then strip it back and simplify it, but just get the feel of the way these conditions work and see how to script them for yourself before we move on to the next point.